How's it going, American History 2 students? Welcome back for another video lesson. This is day 158 of 180 of a normal school year, and this is COVID-19 shutdown day number 30. This is your lesson for Thursday, May 7th, 2020. Let's do our warm-up, then we'll get into our lessons, which will be the 5.8 notes. What was the DMZ? The Demilitarized Zone. This is located at the 38th parallel. It is the space between North and South Korea in which American and South Korean forces are on one side, the southern side, and on the northern side, of course, are the Kim Jong soldiers, the North Korean soldiers, and they are at a constant ceasefire, but still no peace treaty has been decided. So in other words, it's where South and North Korea meet. Is China a communist or democratic nation? Ever since Mao took over, it is a communist and still is to this day. Who was Mao Zedong? He implemented the communist revolution in China, the first communist leader of China. So the first one is demilitarized zone, the second one is communist, and the third one is the first communist leader of China. Let's go ahead and get into our lesson today. This is 5.8 notes. Now, this is one of your shortest note sections ever, as it's only 2 slides. That being said, it is chock full of important, very important information. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this, and I'm going to talk about the Cold War policies of Nixon and President Ronald Reagan. Detente. This was the Nixon Cold War philosophy. It came from Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, one of the most influential Secretary of States of all time. And it would be a policy that would be adopted by Ford, who was his vice president, and Carter, the Democrat, who would follow Ford. So the timeline here is Nixon's elected 2 times. He is impeached for Watergate. We'll talk about that later. He resigns before he can be removed from office. His second vice president, Ford, because his first one resigned for a tax fraud, Spiro Agnew, becomes president. Ford runs against Carter, so Ford's the only president never to be elected. Then Carter takes over. Detente is basically acceptance of communism. So we went to containment with Truman, with Eisenhower, and then with Nixon, it's all about acceptance. He is the first president to visit communist China. When he arrives, he bows to Mao. A lot of people see that as a sign of weakness. But in his eyes, Nixon and his Secretary of State, Kissinger, communists had become communism in Europe, and now Southeast Asia had become too big and too powerful. So that doesn't mean we should let it influence the United States here, but as far as foreign policy, it's just a devil we're going to have to deal with. With Nixon, he is very intense. He is brilliant. As corrupt as he is, he's very brilliant. And the Russians respect Nixon, and they in many ways fear him. Ford is a blip on the radar. You know, he's kind of a goofy guy, clumsy guy. We'll talk more about him later. But Detente fails under Carter, and here's why. Detente fails under Carter because he's perceived as weak, which he is, and he's easily pushed around. And Detente really is considered dead when the Russians invade Afghanistan and begin to seize oil in the Middle East. And that's the point of which people realize Detente is not working. The Russians are never going to be happy with what they have, just like Hitler, and this problem is going to have to be dealt with. So Detente ultimately fails, which is the acceptance of communism. And there are some things that happened during Detente, though, that we can talk about here. There's the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. There's a second one, SALT I, SALT II. We reduced some of our nuclear weapons. They reduced some of their nuclear weapons. I mentioned that he visits China. He also visits Russia. But here's the thing. It only takes one nuclear weapon to change the world. So it doesn't matter if you have 100,000 nukes. What's it matter if you get rid of 5,000 of them? It's not really going to matter. So Detente, while somewhat sustainable under Nixon, over time failed with Ford and Carter. People were looking for strength, in particular when it came to dealing with Russia. This allowed President Reagan to win a landslide victory in 1980. Now, Reagan has a ton of stuff here. He is the president who ends the Cold War, not just ends it, but it's a win for the Western world. Now, this is a slide that's chock full of information. I'm just trying to consolidate all this information for you. So let's look at what we have here. With Reagan, he had a few Cold War philosophies: peace through strength and trust but verify. His goal was to build up our nuclear arsenal, and he knew the Soviets couldn't keep up. We'll simply outspend them. So here's his thinking. If we build a ton of new nuclear weapons, state-of-the-art nuclear weapons, and modernize our military, the Russians are going to try to keep up, which at first they can. There's only one problem. Since they're a communist nation, they're trying to house everybody, feed everybody, and there's no private property. He knows that they can't afford to make communism sustainable and spend on their military. So he outspends them, and they try to keep up. His goal is to defeat communism, not to contain it. The game changer is this. Star Wars Defense System is the nickname, but its technical name is SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. It is an anti-ballistic missile system. In other words, it's a missile that shoots other missiles. The goal of SDI is to have a space station in which if the Russians tried to nuke us, we could shoot their nukes down in space before they got here. He convinced the Soviets, while we do have anti-ballistic missile systems like that today, no such thing was possible in the 80s when Reagan was proposing this, even though he was continuing to pursue it. He convinced the Russians, though, that we were going to obtain this, so they tried to create their own SDI. And they pursued and poured more money into it than the United States did, who realized that at the time, maybe down the road this is feasible, but not now. And they try to spin with him, and SDI ends up being the thing that bankrupts them. He plans a lot of these things with Pope John Paul II, leader of the Catholic Church, and Margaret Thatcher, who is a conservative Tory, who is a big political leader, their prime minister in England. Reagan is a Republican, very conservative. He was the face of the Republican Party from when he became president in 80, I would say, through Donald Trump. I would say now it's more Trump's party, but it had been the Reagan party up until that point. He does a lot of this negotiating because he is willing to meet with the Soviets, and he meets with them at 3 summits. These are like Russian names: Reykjavik, Glasnost, and Perestroika. Reykjavik, Glasnost, and Perestroika. These are 3 conferences between the American leader Ronald Reagan and the guy who had become their prime minister, Mikhail Gorbachev. When it looks like the Soviet Union is on the teeter of collapsing, he goes to Germany, he goes on the western side of the Berlin Wall, and he utters the most famous words of his presidency: "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And after he leaves office, the wall comes down. People take to the streets, they tear it down, they rise above communism. The goal for Ronald Reagan wasn't to accept communism, contain communism, not even necessarily only defeat it, but to transcend it, to show that the American way, freedom and democracy, will rise above communism and be a more sustainable model. He wasn't a warmonger, despite what many people think, but he did spend a ton of money on the military, which led him to cut other programs such as food stamps and welfare. So sometimes he was seen as heartless by the Democratic and the more liberal side. America, after Vietnam, had a lot of shame in its military. Reagan was responsible for building up pride in that military. His nickname was the Great Communicator. He was a great orator. And I'd probably say, if you look at post-World War II, so past FDR, I'd say Reagan and Obama are the 2 best speakers as far as inspiring people, being able to communicate their message. Also, they both seem very down to earth. Clinton was good at that as well, but those are probably the 3 greatest speakers post-Roosevelt. So great communicator was a name that stuck. Reagan was he was a great president, whether you're Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, it doesn't matter. He was a great president. He restored the economy and he defeated the Soviets with his plan and ended the Cold War. We got a few other Cold War things to hit here and there, but for the most part, we are on the verge of wrapping this up. There is one thing I wanted to cover here. I'm going to go ahead and do 5.9 since this is a very short lesson, and then we can do 5.10 to wrap up this section. 5.9 talks about NATO. NATO is the main thing from this 2-slide section. It is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's an international peacekeeping organization of democratic nations post-World War II. Each country pays their dues. America has paid the most of any, though, as far as financially, and an attack on one is an attack on all. So when we were attacked on 9/11, other NATO nations like France, Canada, Great Britain, they rushed to our aid. CETA is the same thing as NATO for Southeast Asia, although not as impactful. The Warsaw Pact was NATO for the Soviet communist side. The Warsaw Pact, Russia was taking over everything. So, pact is kind of more like being conquered instead of a pact. But what I want you to focus on here is NATO. The UN, I mentioned this already, the UN came about as a international peacekeeping organization headquartered in New York. I've covered this already, but I'll just review it. Most every nation in the world has an ambassador to the UN. If there's a crisis, then you have the UN Security Council, which has 15 members, 10 countries rotate in and out. 5 are permanent. The 5 permanent members are U.S., Canada, France, U.S., not Canada, U.S., France, England, China, and Russia. But in order for the UN to do anything, there has to be a unanimous vote, so usually China and Russia vote together and block everything that the other Western nations really want to pursue. This makes the UN slow and often ineffective. Democrats like it because it has the world share the responsibility of conflicts. Republicans don't necessarily tend to like to use it because it makes us look like we're behind and America should be leading. So the focus here really isn't going to be the UN. NATO is super important, but the main thing here today was Detente and the Reagan philosophy toward ending the Cold War. That's going to wrap it up for this video lesson today. Please email me if you have any questions. You can reach me at bsbell@clevelandcountyschools.org. Thank you. Stay safe.